"Daddy, it hurts, make it stop." Lily's fragile voice broke the silence of the cold night, her small body twisting in pain on the bed. Her father, Tom, shot up from his own restless sleep, heart pounding, the sound of his daughter's cry still echoing in his ears. For a moment, he sat in the dark, disoriented, thinking he might have imagined it, but then her voice came again, louder this time, more desperate. "Daddy, please. It hurts so much." Tom's heart clenched as he threw off the blankets and rushed down the narrow, dimly lit hallway toward Lily's room. The house was freezing, colder than usual for an autumn night, the draft slipping through the cracked window frames. When he reached Lily's room, he found her curled up tightly on her bed, her small hands clutching her stomach, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "Daddy," she whimpered, her breath coming in short, painful gasps, "please, help me." Tom's heart shattered. Lily, just 8 years old, too young to carry the weight of everything they'd been through in the past months. First, they lost Claire, Lily's mother, Tom's wife, the center of their world. Claire's death had been sudden, unexpected, and it had left them broken. And now, this pain that was tearing his little girl apart, and Tom didn't know what to do. He knelt by her side, his hand trembling as he touched her forehead. She was burning up. His mind raced, trying to think, trying to remember all the things Claire used to do when the girls were sick. But Claire wasn't here. She couldn't guide him through this. "I've got you, sweetheart," Tom whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I'm here. I'm going to help you." But how? He thought of taking her to the hospital, the only sensible option, but reality hit him like a brick. His car was still broken. It had died on him last week, and he hadn't had the money to fix it, not after losing his job. Every cent had gone to keeping food on the table and the lights on. There was no money for repairs, no way to drive her to the hospital. The crushing weight of helplessness pressed down on him. He couldn't take her anywhere, and she was in so much pain. His mind scrambled for a solution. The house was freezing, the cold biting at his skin. But his bedroom, the coldest room in the house, might help ease her pain. Maybe if he kept her cool, it would help the fever go down. It was all he could think of. Tom scooped Lily into his arms, her small frame trembling against him. She whimpered, her tears soaking into his shirt as she clung to him. "I want Mommy," she whispered, her voice so weak it broke Tom's heart all over again. "I know, baby. I know." Tom's voice cracked, the pain of hearing her call for Claire, who was no longer there, unbearable. "Mommy's watching over you, I promise. She's always with you." But that didn't stop the pain. It didn't stop the tears. Tom carried her down the hallway and into his bedroom, where the air was even colder. He laid her gently on the bed, pulling the thick blanket over her shivering body, hoping it would help, hoping it would be enough. He sat on the edge of the bed, stroking her hair, feeling more helpless than ever. Meanwhile, outside the house, Sarah, Tom's older daughter, was pulling into the driveway with her boyfriend, Ethan. Sarah, 19, had been struggling just as much as Tom to cope with their mother's death. She had taken on responsibilities beyond her years, trying to fill the gap that Claire had left behind. But it wasn't easy, and her relationship with Ethan had become another source of stress in her life. Tonight, they were arguing again, just like they had been doing more frequently these days. "I just don't understand why you have to be out there all the time." Sarah's voice was sharp, her frustration palpable as they stepped out of the car. "Sarah, I'm a cop. It's my job," Ethan replied, his tone firm but calm. Ethan, 22, with his short-cropped brown hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, had always been protective of Sarah, but he took his job seriously. Being a police officer wasn't just what he did, it was who he was. "But it's dangerous. Every time you walk out that door, I'm scared you won't come back," Sarah's voice cracked, betraying the depth of her fear. Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know. But I can't just stop doing my job. You knew that when we started dating." "I know, but," Sarah began, but she stopped suddenly, hearing something strange. Her brows furrowed as she turned her head toward the house. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice lower now, tense. Ethan nodded. There was a faint sound coming from inside the house. It sounded like crying. Sarah's heart sank. "Lily," she whispered, her fear for her sister instantly overriding the argument with Ethan. Without another word, she ran toward the front door, Ethan close behind her. They burst through the door, the crying now louder, clearer. Lily's voice, small and full of pain, echoing through the quiet house. "Daddy, please." Sarah's chest tightened with panic as she and Ethan rushed down the hallway. "Dad! What's going on?" she called, but there was no answer, only Lily's cries. They reached Tom's bedroom, and Sarah froze in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock. There, on the bed, was her father, looking exhausted and distraught, sitting beside Lily, who was curled up in pain under the blankets. "Dad!" Sarah's voice was shaking now, a mixture of fear and confusion. "What's wrong with her?" Tom looked up, his face pale, his eyes filled with guilt and desperation. "I don't know," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "She's in so much pain. I don't know what to do." Sarah's heart broke at the sight of her father, who had always seemed so strong, now looking lost and helpless. She had been so angry with him since their mother died, blaming him for not being able to hold the family together. But now, seeing him like this, she realized how much he was struggling too. "We need to get her to a hospital," Ethan said, stepping forward, his voice steady and calm, though his eyes were filled with concern. "Where's the car?" Tom shook his head, his voice filled with shame. "The car's broken. I can't afford to fix it." For a moment, there was only silence. Sarah felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. They had no way to get Lily to the hospital. No way to help her. Ethan knelt beside the bed, looking at Lily, his face serious. "We can't wait, Tom. She's burning up." Tom swallowed hard, feeling the tears threatening to spill over. "I know. I don't know what to do." Sarah took a deep breath, her mind racing. She couldn't lose her sister. Not after losing her mother. "I'll call an ambulance," she said, grabbing her phone. But the thought of the cost made her hesitate. They couldn't afford that either. Before she could dial, Lily let out a sharp cry, clutching her stomach even tighter. Tom's face went white as he reached for her, panic rising in his chest. "Lily, baby, hang on. Please, hang on." But then, suddenly, Lily's small body went limp, her head falling back against the pillow. "Lily!" Tom screamed, his voice filled with raw terror. Sarah dropped her phone, her heart stopping in her chest as she watched her sister's body go still. "Lily!" Tom's voice echoed through the room, raw with terror as he watched his daughter's body fall limp on the bed. His hands shook as he reached for her, panic flooding his every thought. He had never felt so helpless, so utterly powerless. The one thing he had left, the only part of Claire that still connected him to this world, was slipping away, and he didn't know how to stop it. "Dad!" Sarah cried out, rushing to the bed, her own fear freezing her in place for a split second before she fell to her knees beside her sister. "Lily, wake up." She shook Lily gently, but there was no response. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she looked up at Ethan, who stood beside them, his face tense with concern. "We need to move now," Ethan said firmly, pulling out his phone. "We're calling an ambulance." "No, wait," Tom said, his voice breaking, full of desperation. "We can't afford it. They'll bill us, and I can't." His words trailed off, the weight of his failures crashing down on him all at once. He couldn't provide for his family anymore. He couldn't even afford to save his own daughter. How had things gotten this bad? How had he fallen so far? But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. "Ethan, do it," she said through gritted teeth, her voice shaking with emotion. "We'll deal with the cost later. Lily can't wait." Ethan nodded without hesitation, dialing 911 and quickly explaining the situation to the dispatcher. Meanwhile, Sarah grabbed Lily's small hand, squeezing it tightly, as if willing her sister to wake up through sheer force of love and desperation. "Lily, come on, please," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "You can't leave us. We already lost Mom. We can't lose you too. Please, wake up." Tom's heart shattered at the sight of his daughters, one fighting for her life, and the other clinging to hope that was slipping away too quickly. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. They were supposed to be together, a family. Claire was supposed to be here, to hold them all together, to tell them it would be okay. But she was gone, and Tom had no idea how to keep going without her. As Ethan finished the call, he turned back to Tom and Sarah. "The ambulance is on its way," he said, trying to sound calm, but the tension in his voice betrayed his fear. "They'll be here soon." "Soon?" Tom snapped, his voice rising with panic. "What if soon isn't fast enough? What if she..." His voice broke, and he couldn't finish the sentence. The thought of losing Lily, his sweet, innocent little girl, was too much to bear. "Dad," Sarah said softly, trying to keep her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "We have to stay calm. The paramedics will be here any minute. Lily's going to be okay. She has to be." But even as she said the words, Sarah wasn't sure she believed them. The weight of the last few months, the grief of losing their mother, the strain of watching their father fall apart, the fear that had been gnawing at her every day since, was all crashing down on her now. And seeing her sister like this, so fragile, so still, it was almost too much. Tom sank to the floor beside the bed, his hands covering his face. He couldn't hold it in anymore. All the guilt, the shame, the fear, it all came pouring out. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with sobs. "I'm so sorry I couldn't fix the car. I'm sorry I couldn't take care of you. I'm sorry, Claire, I'm failing. I'm failing all of you." Sarah's heart twisted at the sight of her father, so broken, so defeated. For so long, she had been angry with him, blaming him for not being stronger, for not holding their family together after Claire died. But now, looking at him like this, she realized something she hadn't seen before. He was just as lost as she was. He was grieving, drowning in his own pain, and he didn't know how to get out. "Dad," Sarah said softly, reaching out to him, "this isn't your fault. You didn't fail us. You're doing the best you can. We all are." But Tom shook his head, tears falling freely down his face. "It's not enough, Sarah, it's not enough. I couldn't save Claire, and now I can't save Lily." Suddenly, Lily stirred, letting out a faint moan. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat. "Lily," she whispered, leaning closer. "Lily, can you hear me?" Lily's eyelids fluttered open, her face pale and sweat-soaked, but she was conscious again. Sarah," she whispered, her voice weak and raspy. "I'm here, Lily, I'm right here," Sarah said quickly, her hand still gripping Lily's tightly. "You're going to be okay, I promise. The ambulance is coming." Tom let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, but the relief was short-lived. Lily was still far from safe, and the ambulance hadn't arrived yet. The minutes stretched on painfully, each second feeling like an eternity as they waited. Finally, after what felt like hours, the faint sound of sirens cut through the night air. Ethan rushed to the door, guiding the paramedics inside, their faces calm and professional as they quickly assessed Lily's condition. They lifted her gently onto a stretcher, their movements swift but careful. Sarah watched, her heart pounding, as they wheeled her sister toward the door. Tom stood frozen, unsure if he should follow, unsure of anything anymore. "You should go with her," Ethan said softly, placing a hand on Tom's shoulder. "She'll need you." Tom nodded, but he still felt paralyzed, his legs heavy as if they were made of lead. "I don't know what to say to her," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "Just be there," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "That's what she needs right now." Sarah watched as the paramedics loaded Lily into the ambulance, her mind swirling with fear and guilt. She wished she had been there sooner. She wished she could have done something, anything, to prevent this. "Sarah, come with us," Tom said, his voice trembling as he turned to her. "Please. I need you there." For a moment, Sarah hesitated, her mind flashing back to all the times she had fought with her father since their mother's death. But this wasn't the time for that. Right now, they needed to be together. Lily needed them both. "Okay," Sarah whispered, stepping forward. "Let's go." The ambulance doors slammed shut, and the siren wailed as they sped toward the hospital. Inside, Tom sat beside Lily, his hand resting on hers as she lay still, her breathing shallow. "Stay with me, Lily," Tom whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Please, don't leave me too." The ambulance lights flickered in the night as they rushed through the empty streets, the weight of the moment pressing down on them all. Tom's heart ached with every second that passed, each beat of the siren a reminder of how close he was to losing everything. Again. And then, as they neared the hospital, Lily's body went limp again. Her eyes fluttered shut, and her breathing slowed. "Lily!" Tom's voice cracked, panic rising in his chest. "Lily, wake up." The paramedics sprang into action, their voices urgent as they worked to stabilize her. But Tom could barely hear them over the sound of his own heart pounding in his ears. Sarah's hand tightened around his, her own fear mirrored in her wide, tear-filled eyes. And in that moment, Tom felt the icy grip of fear close around him once more. The ambulance's sirens wailed through the quiet, cold night as it sped toward the hospital. Inside, the tension was unbearable. Tom sat frozen, his hand gripping Lily's small, limp hand as if his touch alone could bring her back. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind filled with terror and guilt. This was his worst nightmare, and it was playing out before him in real time. "Lily, baby, please," he whispered, his voice breaking as tears blurred his vision. "Please, hang on, don't leave me. Don't leave us." Beside him, Sarah was holding her breath, her eyes never leaving Lily's still face. It was the same face that had once been full of laughter, a little girl who used to run around the house, her giggles filling every room with joy. But now, her skin was pale, her breathing shallow, and the warmth that had once radiated from her seemed to be slipping away with each passing second. The paramedics worked quickly, their voices calm but urgent as they checked her vitals, their hands moving with precision and purpose. "We're almost there," one of them said, though his words did little to comfort Tom. He didn't care how close they were. All that mattered was that Lily wasn't responding. And the fear of what might happen next was suffocating him. "Stay with me, Lily, please, stay with me." Sarah reached over, placing her hand on Tom's arm, squeezing it gently. "Dad, she's strong. She'll make it." But even as she said it, Sarah could feel the doubt creeping in. She wanted to believe it, she needed to believe it, but seeing Lily like this, it made her question everything. It made her remember how quickly they had lost Claire, how powerless they had been to stop it. What if they were powerless again? The ambulance lurched as it made a sharp turn into the hospital's emergency bay. The paramedics were out of the vehicle in seconds, moving Lily onto a gurney with practiced ease. Tom stumbled out of the ambulance, his legs feeling weak beneath him, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from Lily as they wheeled her inside. "Lily," he called out, his voice shaking with desperation. But there was no response. She lay still, her face pale against the hospital sheets, and it was all Tom could do to keep from collapsing. "Come on, we need to move," one of the paramedics said firmly, guiding Tom and Sarah toward the entrance. Ethan, who had been following behind in his car, arrived just in time, parking hastily before running to meet them. "Where is she?" Ethan asked breathlessly, his usually composed demeanor cracking as he took in the scene, the panic in Tom's eyes, the tears in Sarah's. He reached out, wrapping his arm around Sarah's shoulders, pulling her close as she fought to hold back the sobs threatening to escape. "They're taking her in now," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling as she leaned into Ethan. "I don't know if she's going to be okay." Tom followed closely as they rushed Lily into the emergency room, but the doors swung shut in front of him. A nurse stepped in his way, her expression gentle but firm. "I'm sorry, sir, but you need to wait here while we examine her." "No," Tom shouted, panic rising in his throat. "I need to be with her. She needs me. Please," the nurse said softly, placing a hand on his arm. "I understand, but right now, we need to focus on helping her. We'll come get you as soon as we can." Tom felt his knees weaken, and Sarah quickly moved to his side, helping him sit down in one of the waiting room chairs. The cold, sterile lights of the hospital felt suffocating. The walls closed in around him, the steady beeping of machines and the distant voices of doctors doing little to ease the gnawing fear in his chest. Time passed slowly, each second dragging into the next as they waited. Tom stared at the door that separated him from Lily, his mind racing. He thought of Claire, how he had watched her slip away from him, just like this. He had sat at her bedside for days, holding her hand, praying for a miracle that never came. And now, he was here again, on the verge of losing the only piece of Claire he had left. "I can't lose her," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can't lose her, too." Sarah sat beside him, her hand trembling as she clutched her phone, waiting for news, waiting for anything. Ethan stood behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders, trying to provide some comfort, though he, too, felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. Suddenly, the doors to the emergency room swung open, and a doctor emerged. His face was serious, his expression unreadable, and Tom's heart skipped a beat. "How is she?" Tom asked, his voice shaky, the words catching in his throat. The doctor glanced down at the clipboard in his hand before meeting Tom's eyes. "She's stable for now, but it's serious. We're going to need to operate immediately." The room seemed to tilt as the words sank in. "Operate?" Tom echoed, his voice filled with dread. "Her appendix is severely inflamed," the doctor explained, his tone measured but urgent. "We need to remove it before it ruptures. If it does, it could lead to a life-threatening infection." Tom felt like the floor had fallen out from under him. Is she going to be okay?" The doctor hesitated, just for a moment, but it was enough to send a chill down Tom's spine. "We're doing everything we can. But we need to act quickly." Before Tom could respond, the doctor turned and disappeared back through the doors. The weight of his words hung in the air like a heavy fog. "Everything we can." But what if it wasn't enough? Tom collapsed back into the chair, his hands covering his face. He felt utterly useless, completely powerless to help his daughter. Claire had been the strong one. She would have known what to do, how to comfort him, how to comfort Lily. But now, all he had was this gnawing fear that he was failing. Again. Sarah leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder, her body shaking with silent sobs. "Why is this happening?" she whispered. "Why does everything keep falling apart?" Ethan stroked her hair gently, his own heart heavy with worry. He didn't have the answers she needed, and that made it all the more painful. "I don't know, Sarah. I wish I did." They sat in silence for what felt like hours, the sterile ticking of the wall clock the only sound in the room. Tom stared at the floor, his mind racing with thoughts of Lily, thoughts of Claire, thoughts of all the ways he had let them down. He should have been able to fix the car. He should have been able to get Lily to the hospital sooner. He should have. The doors to the operating room opened once again, and this time, a nurse appeared, her face calm but serious. She looked directly at Tom, and his stomach twisted with fear. "She's out of surgery," the nurse said, her voice steady. "But..." Tom's heart stopped. "But what?" The nurse hesitated, her eyes filled with sympathy. "There were complications. She's in the ICU now, and she's stable, but the next 24 hours will be critical." Tom's breath caught in his throat. He had been holding on to the hope that once the surgery was over, everything would be okay. But now, hearing this, the fear gripped him even tighter. "We'll let you see her soon," the nurse said, her voice soft, as if trying to offer comfort. "She's resting now." Tom felt his legs go weak as he stood, his hands trembling as he tried to process the nurse's words. "Critical." The word echoed in his mind, growing louder with every second that passed. Sarah stood beside him, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Dad." Tom couldn't speak. His worst fear was coming true. He might lose her. He might lose Lily just like he lost Claire. The nurse turned to walk away, leaving Tom standing there, his world crumbling around him. He stared at the door that led to the ICU, feeling like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering, about to fall. And in that moment, the weight of everything, the guilt, the fear, the pain, came crashing down on him. The words "critical condition" echoed in Tom's mind as he stood there, frozen, staring at the door to the ICU. His legs felt like they could give out at any moment, but somehow, he managed to remain standing. His daughter, his sweet Lily, was lying behind those doors, fighting for her life. Every second felt like it stretched into eternity. His world was unraveling again, just like it had when Claire died. Tom had barely held on after Claire's death. He had struggled, tried to keep things together for his daughters, but now, everything was slipping through his fingers again. His mind was racing, filled with the agonizing memories of losing Claire, how helpless he had felt watching her slip away, and how, in the end, there had been nothing he could do. Now, he was standing on the brink of losing Lily too. Beside him, Sarah clung tightly to Ethan, her face pale and streaked with silent tears. She had never looked so vulnerable, so lost. Tom wanted to comfort her, to be the father she needed, but he felt as if he was drowning in his own despair. He had no strength left to give. "Sarah, Ethan," a nurse called softly from the hallway. "You can see her now, but only for a few minutes. She needs to rest." Tom barely heard the words as Sarah nodded and led the way. His legs felt heavy as he followed them through the sterile, cold hallway into the ICU, where the mechanical beeping of monitors filled the air. There, in the middle of the small room, lay Lily, pale and still, connected to machines that monitored her every breath. Tom's heart broke all over again at the sight of her. The bright, happy little girl who used to run through the house, laughing and dancing with Claire, was now so small and fragile, lying in a hospital bed, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. He felt a deep, gut-wrenching ache in his soul. "Lily," Sarah whispered, leaning close to her sister, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "I'm here. I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere." Tom stood at the foot of the bed, staring at his daughter, the knot in his throat tightening. He couldn't find the words. What could he say? That he was sorry? That he should have gotten her to the hospital sooner? That he was failing, again, when his family needed him the most? The nurse stepped back, giving them space, but the atmosphere in the room was thick with tension and grief. Tom swallowed hard, trying to keep his emotions in check, but the weight of it all was too much to bear. How did it get to this? He thought bitterly, staring at Lily's pale face. If only he had been a better father. If only he had been able to fix the car. If only he hadn't lost his job. The what ifs swirled around him, suffocating him. "I should have done more," Tom whispered under his breath, barely audible. "This is my fault." Sarah, who was sitting beside Lily's bed, turned toward her father, her eyes red and tired. "Dad, no," she said softly, her voice shaking. "It's not your fault." But Tom shook his head, unable to look her in the eye. "Yes, it is. I couldn't take care of her. I couldn't get her here in time. I failed you both, just like I failed your mother." Sarah stood, her fists clenched at her sides. "You didn't fail Mom, and you haven't failed us," she said, her voice rising. "You've done the best you can. We're all just trying to survive, Dad." Tom felt the sting of her words, but it didn't ease the guilt. He wasn't surviving. He was barely holding on, and now Lily was paying the price. He turned toward the door, unable to face the sight of his daughter hooked up to machines any longer. He needed to get out of that room. He needed air. "I just need a minute," he muttered, not waiting for a response. He walked out of the room, the cold hallway swallowing him up as he stumbled toward the exit. The weight of everything pressed down on him like a crushing force, and he needed to escape, even if just for a moment. Ethan watched him go, his brow furrowed with concern, but he didn't follow. Instead, he remained by Sarah's side, silently supporting her as she kept vigil over her sister. Outside, the cold night air hit Tom like a slap in the face. He hadn't realized how stifling the hospital had been until he was standing in the empty parking lot, staring up at the stars. He leaned against the cold metal of a car, his body shaking as the sobs finally broke free. He couldn't hold it in anymore. Tears streamed down his face, his chest heaving as years of grief and guilt poured out of him. He had been trying so hard, for so long, to keep everything together. But the truth was, he was crumbling. He had failed Claire, and now he was failing Lily. He wasn't strong enough. He wasn't enough. "Claire," he whispered into the night, his voice broken. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I can't do this without you." For the first time in months, he allowed himself to truly feel the depth of his loss. He had been trying to push it down, to be strong for his daughters, but now, standing alone in the dark, he couldn't pretend anymore. Claire was gone, and he was alone, and he didn't know how to save his daughter. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. Tom wiped his eyes quickly, trying to compose himself before turning to see Ethan standing a few feet away, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets, his expression serious but kind. "She's stable, for now," Ethan said quietly. "But it's going to be a long night." Tom nodded, unable to meet Ethan's eyes. He felt too ashamed, too broken. "I don't know how to fix this," he whispered. "I don't know how to keep going." Ethan stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to do it alone, Tom. You've been trying to carry all of this by yourself, and it's too much. Let people help you." Tom shook his head, his voice filled with regret. "I should have fixed the car. I should have gotten her here sooner." "You can't change the past," Ethan said softly. "What matters now is that you're here. You're here for her, and that's what she needs." Tom felt his chest tighten with emotion. Ethan's words hit him hard, but they also offered a small glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was still time to be the father Lily needed. Maybe he could still make things right. "I don't know how to be what she needs," Tom admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Ethan sighed, shaking his head slightly. "Tom, you've been through more than most people can imagine. But you're still standing. That's enough. You being here, caring, fighting for her, that's what matters." Tom swallowed hard, the weight of his guilt still heavy but no longer crushing. He wiped his face again and nodded, though his voice was still shaky. I can't lose her, Ethan. I can't lose Lily." Ethan placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, squeezing it gently. "You won't. We're not giving up on her. And neither should you." Tom closed his eyes, taking a deep, shaky breath. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't lost everything yet. They stood in silence for a few moments longer before Tom finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to see her." Ethan nodded. "Let's go back inside." Together, they walked back into the hospital, the cold night air left behind as they stepped into the sterile, quiet hallway. The fear was still there, the uncertainty, but now it was tempered with something else, a glimmer of hope, fragile but real. As they entered the ICU again, Tom saw Sarah sitting by Lily's bedside, holding her hand. The sight filled him with a sense of purpose, a reminder that he still had something to fight for. Lily stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering, and Tom's heart leapt in his chest. She was still with him. She was still fighting. "I'm here, baby," Tom whispered as he sat beside her. "I'm not going anywhere. We're going to get through this. Together." But just as those words left his mouth, one of the machines by Lily's bed let out a loud, piercing beep. Tom's heart stopped as the nurses rushed into the room, their faces filled with urgency. Something was wrong. The piercing beep of the machine cut through the room like a knife, sending Tom's heart plummeting into his stomach. The nurses rushed in, their movements swift and practiced, but the panic in their eyes told him that something was very wrong. Sarah stood frozen, her hand still clutching Lily's, but now trembling with fear. "What's happening?" Tom's voice came out hoarse, barely audible as the fear choked him. His legs felt weak, but he forced himself to stand, to move closer to his daughter. "What's happening to her?" One of the nurses, a woman with a calm but serious expression, glanced at him as she checked Lily's vitals. "Her heart rate's dropping. We need to stabilize her, now." Tom's world spun. His knees buckled, and he grabbed the side of the bed for support, his hands trembling as he watched the nurses work frantically around Lily. The machines continued to beep wildly, and Tom's heart raced in time with the chaotic sounds. "Dad," Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, filled with terror as she stepped closer to him, her eyes wide and filled with tears. "What if she—" Tom shook his head, refusing to let her finish that thought. "No. Don't say it, Sarah. Don't. She's going to make it. She has to." But even as he said the words, his heart twisted with doubt. Claire's face flashed in his mind, how she had slipped away, how he had sat helplessly by her bedside, unable to stop what was happening. Was this going to happen again? Was he going to lose Lily too? Tom watched helplessly as the nurses worked around Lily, adjusting the machines, checking her pulse, trying to bring her back. Every second felt like an eternity. The room was filled with tension, with fear. Tom could feel it in his bones, that gnawing sense of helplessness that had plagued him since Claire's death. But then, suddenly, the frantic beeping began to slow. The chaos in the room started to calm. One of the nurses checked Lily's pulse again and nodded to her colleague. "She's stabilizing," the nurse said quietly, and the relief in her voice was palpable. Tom exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His legs gave out, and he collapsed into the chair beside Lily's bed, his whole body shaking from the adrenaline and fear. Sarah sank down beside him, her hand still holding onto Lily's tightly, as if she was afraid to let go. "She's okay?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with hope and uncertainty. The nurse nodded. "For now, yes. But she's still very weak. The next few hours are critical. We'll be monitoring her closely." Tom nodded, unable to find the words. His heart was still racing, his mind reeling from what had just happened. But Lily was still with them. She was still fighting. And that was all that mattered right now. As the nurses left the room, Tom leaned forward, resting his head in his hands, his body shaking with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. He had come so close to losing her. Too close. And the fear of that still gripped him like a vice. Ethan, who had been standing quietly by the door, stepped forward, his face filled with concern but also with quiet strength. "She's a fighter, Tom," he said softly, his voice steady. "She's going to pull through this." Tom looked up at him, his eyes red and tired. "I almost lost her, Ethan," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I almost lost her, and I don't know if I could have survived that." Ethan knelt beside him, his hand resting on Tom's shoulder. "But you didn't lose her. She's still here. And you're here for her." Tom nodded, though the weight of everything still pressed heavily on his heart. For so long, he had carried the guilt of Claire's death, the guilt of not being able to save her. And now, standing on the edge of almost losing Lily too, that guilt had threatened to consume him. But something was shifting inside him now, something was breaking free. "Dad," Sarah's voice pulled him out of his thoughts. She was still sitting beside Lily, her eyes fixed on their sister's face. "She's going to be okay, right?" Tom took a deep breath, steadying himself as he stood up and moved closer to Lily's bed. He reached out, taking her small hand in his, feeling the warmth that still radiated from her, even in her fragile state. She was still here. She was still fighting. "She's going to be okay," Tom said quietly, but this time, there was more certainty in his voice. "We're going to get through this. All of us." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, but there was a glimmer of hope there too. She nodded slowly, her grip on Lily's hand tightening. "We have to. For her. For Mom." Tom swallowed hard, feeling the lump in his throat as he thought of Claire. He had spent so many months blaming himself for her death, for not being able to save her. But Claire wouldn't have wanted this. She wouldn't have wanted him to carry that guilt, to let it weigh him down. She would have wanted him to fight. To be there for their daughters. And that's what he was going to do. As the hours passed, Tom and Sarah stayed by Lily's side, watching her, waiting, praying. Ethan stayed with them too, his quiet presence a source of strength and comfort. The minutes ticked by slowly, but Lily's breathing remained steady, her heart rate stable. It was in the early hours of the morning when Lily finally stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, just barely, and she looked up at Tom, her voice weak but clear. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the tubes and exhaustion. Tom's heart soared. He leaned down, his hand gently stroking her hair. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here." Lily blinked slowly, her gaze shifting between Tom and Sarah, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I had a dream. I saw Mommy." Tom's breath caught in his throat, but he smiled through his tears. "Yeah. What did she say?" "She said, everything's going to be okay," Lily whispered, her voice soft but full of warmth. Tom felt the tears spill over, but this time, they weren't tears of fear or grief. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope. Claire had always been the light in their lives, and now, even in death, she was still guiding them, still watching over them. Sarah leaned forward, brushing a tear from her cheek as she kissed Lily's forehead. "Mom was right," she whispered. "Everything's going to be okay." For the first time in what felt like forever, Tom allowed himself to believe that. They had been through so much pain, so much loss, but they had made it through. And they would keep moving forward, together. As the morning light began to filter through the hospital window, casting a soft glow over the room, Tom sat by Lily's side, his heart full of gratitude. They had come so close to losing her, but now, she was here. Alive. Strong. A reminder that, even in the darkest moments, there was always hope. Tom took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past few months slowly lift from his shoulders. The guilt, the fear, the pain, it was all still there, but now it was tempered with something else. Redemption. He had made mistakes. He had faltered. But he hadn't failed. And as he looked at his daughters, at the family he still had, he knew one thing for sure. They were going to be okay.